Hello there, welcome to the channel. Thanks for stopping by, stopping the scroll, or maybe YouTube's been kind to me and shoved me under your nose in your feed. But either way, welcome. It's good to see you. Today I want to talk about guitars. So I've done a little kind of series on EQing, and I've looked at various aspects of the drum kit. I've looked at bass guitar, and so the next sort of path to take that seemed to make sense to me was to talk about EQing electric guitars. Perhaps I may do a separate video on acoustic guitars, but let me know in the comments if that's something you'd like to see. So electric guitars, I mixed a lot of electric guitars. I tend to mix guitars quite loudly, probably because I am I call myself a guitar player, but I'm not really. I haven't played guitar in years, but it's my first instrument, so it's what I understand, and I love the sound of heavy guitars in rock music, and so I inherently tend to push them. So in order to push them to make our guitars sound massive, we need to do some EQ work to make sure they fit in the mix and don't sound lackluster or dull or harsh or anything like that. We don't want that. So today I'm going to just outline for you some of the frequency zones that I go to repeatedly when I'm working with guitars, and it seems to work for me. So I'd like to share that with you. I'd also like to share my favourite channel strips for EQing guitar. I said in a previous video, I think, that you choose EQ plugins sometimes just for one band because it sounds particularly good on a particular instrument. 10K on the Pultec sounds particularly nice on cymbals, on drums, as does the 60 Hertz boost on drums as well. But I'm thinking of like the Maag EQ, the Airband on that is famous for it, and people reach for it just to use that particular band. So there are a couple of channel strips that I've learned of and have used, and yeah, they sound great on guitar, so I want to share those with you today as well. Even though I'm using heavy guitars today, the frequency bands that I'm going to suggest to you will work with clean guitars as well. As with previous videos, I'm talking about ranges to go to, sort of small bands of frequencies that tend to work for bringing out certain nuances or cleaning up certain tones and muddiness in instruments. So I'm just giving you kind of a broad range for you to reach for, so that you can get going quickly and get moving through the mix as fast as possible. The most important aspect of EQing anything is to listen to what we've been given and to make some decisions about where we'd like to take the sound. That's sort of preceded by our opinion on the sound, what we think is right or wrong with it. So we're going to start from that angle today and listen to some guitars and decide how we feel they sound and what's wrong with them, what's right with them, and how we can bring out the best from the guitars we've been given in this particular session. The session I'm going to use today is the session that I used in my free drum mixing workshop. So if you've seen that already and worked with that, then you'll be familiar with this tune. But there's been nothing done to the guitars, very little anyway, and so it just seemed a perfect choice to be able to demonstrate how I go about EQing guitars and hopefully giving you a few pointers to help you work a little bit faster at your decision making around EQing. One of the more common problems that I get to work through with my coaching clients is how to hear EQ, how to know what to cut and what to boost. Now, an aspect of that, or a portion of that, is purely down to personal taste and just what feels right to you in that split second of hearing it. At least that's how it works for me. And that's why I've said many times in previous videos how I've got to react quickly, or I pay particular attention to my very first instinct when I'm listening to a soloed instrument, to a soloed group of instruments, to a mix. It's all about that initial reaction that I get in my body, really. And usually it's either somewhere in my chest or somewhere in my stomach, but it's that energy that I particularly pay attention to, because our goal as mixers is to make our audience move. We want them to at least bob their head or tap their foot. So it's all like an exchange of energy, and it's our job, I believe, to bring that out in a mix, so people can fully enjoy the music, the art that is music making and songwriting. I'm also going to give you a couple of tips today to help you dial in the exact amount of cut or boost that you feel is right for the song without second guessing yourself, and believing in yourself that the figure you've settled on is good enough for now, and if it's a problem later on, it will make itself known to you, because you'll just hear it and you'll feel that it's not right, it's not working. But I'm going to give you a method today that will help you, I think, settle on a degree of cut or boost that is right for that particular track. There are a couple of common problems with electric guitars. The first is muddiness, where they just sound thick and heavy and stodgy with a little bit of high end, but not enough to get heard through a mix of drums and vocals and keyboards and everything else. The second problem is harshness, and this tends to be a problem I find when it's guitars, DI guitars that have been put through some sort of amp simulator. And this is when you start to get the real kind of harsh areas to deal with. And to be honest, I don't feel as though in the guitars I'm going to show you today there is any harshness, because they sound like they have all been recorded in the real world with real cabs, real guitars, real microphones. So I think that naturally lends itself to a more rounded sound and less artificial, less artifacts. So I don't think we'll be dealing with too many harsh frequencies today. But what we will be dealing with today is muddiness and bringing clarity to guitars so that they gel in the mix, so that they lock in with the bass guitar and complement, so that the two complement one another, and you end up with this great big wall of heavy guitars. In this session, we've got drums, we've got bass, we've got guitars, obviously. We've got some synths and we've got vocals. These guitar tracks were actually re-recorded because the original guitar tracks the band felt were actually on the thin side and were struggling themselves to get the weight and the energy and the power in the guitars without actually re-recording them. And what's happened there then is that they've perhaps tipped over a little bit into the opposite camp and gone from thin to thick. But that's fine, because I'd rather have thick guitars than thin guitars, because I can find I can carve a better guitar sound out of a thicker starting point than trying to boost low frequencies in thinner guitar parts when there aren't really any low frequencies in the recording to boost as such. And then you start turning to all sorts of things like R-bass and tricks like that. So the majority of the guitar tracks that are all playing at the same time are in the verses in this track. And we've got a guitar 1, we've got a guitar 2, we've got guitar 3, and we've got a guitar 4. And all of them have got their own subtle tonal differences that all build up in layers to give us this big wall of sound. Let me play the first verse to you of the entire mix. I'll mute the vocals and you can get an idea of how this sounds. Okay, you get the picture. I just brought in the bass guitar there briefly. It's also worth pointing out that I haven't mixed the bass guitar here. The guitars are completely unmixed and the bass is completely unmixed, so bear that in mind when we play the mix together as a whole. And the first thing to do is to listen to these guitars and decide what we're going to do with them. We've got two choices here. We can either go in and listen to each one individually and work on that track level to do the EQ, or we can start from a higher point, from a point further down the chain, so through the group, for example. Now, I've routed these heavier guitars through their own group, and that is where I'm going to do the heavy lifting with regard to the EQ. It just seems to make sense because you're able to apply processing to a group of tracks and apply them that processing all in one go and get to a cleaner result much quicker than if you were going into each individual track. So I start at group level first and then work my way down. I don't do that in every case with every instrument group, but in this case I felt as though it was appropriate because they were so thick sounding. It felt as though I needed to do some kind of heavy lifting right from the outset, and so the group seems to be a good area to do that in this case. Let's just listen to some of these tracks soloed. So on the left-hand side, we've got all the darker sounding, heavier, thicker sounding guitar tones. And on the right-hand side, we've got the higher guitar tones. And this is a production choice given to me by the band. That's how they'd recorded the tracks and intended the tracks for the tracks to be mixed. And I, having soloed them all together, I felt that worked really well, actually. So the heavy guitar group that I've created houses these 4 guitars right now. And in the chorus, the heavy guitars sound like this. And the other guitars, I split out and I called them melody guitars. So I've put them to a different group. And the melody guitars are higher up in the register, so they're not quite as thick tonally as the heavy guitars. So they sound like this. So I didn't feel as though they needed such an aggressive treatment as the heavy guitars. That's why I've put them through 2 separate groups. So there's a melody guitar group that houses the guitars that have got more clarity to them, whereas the heavy guitars are more like the heavy rhythm guitars, the palm muted guitars. So today I want to get these thicker sounding guitars sounding clearer. I want to give them a bit more clarity and have them work with the bass guitar better. So if we switch over to the mixer view here, and if I solo all the heavy guitars, then we can begin working on the EQ. So clearly, the first thing we need to do is to carve some space in this low end with these guitars. I don't know why I ended up using the Pro Q3 more often than not on the guitars rather than a channel strip, because channel strips are, I'd use them all over the place. I really enjoy using them. But I think maybe because sometimes I'm able to fine-tune these cuts on the guitar by visually seeing the cue, by working with the cue, the width of it, and deciding how many frequencies, either side of the frequency I choose here, to include in the cut. And for some reason, I prefer doing it on a visual EQ like this rather than on a channel strip in the case of guitars. But I do work with channel strips on guitars. I'll come to that after we've done this corrective EQ with a digital cleaner EQ plugin. So let's have a look at what these guitars are doing. So not tons of stuff going on in the lows, but I always just put in a low cut at about 100 Hertz and see where we are with that. So an audible difference there, not night and day, but certainly some of the low end had disappeared there. Point of note, I suppose I usually stick with 12 dB per octave, but keeping the slopes gentle, and that's usually either 6, 12 or 18 dB per octave for me. So I'm going to go back to 12 and stick with that. Another way of applying the low cut is to take it too far so you can actually hear it thinning out the sound and then pull it back slightly. So that would sound like this. Before I go any further, and if you haven't seen any of the other videos, what I like to do before applying any EQ move is to give it a couple of seconds or a bar or something so that I can just hear the sound as it is, untreated, unaffected, so that I'm just building into my audio memory what that sound is like before we've actually applied any correction. So then when I do apply the correction, I know, it helps me know when to stop, or it helps me know that I've achieved the goal that I have in my head. So I'm going to play this and then I'm just going to listen for 2 or 3 seconds before I start pulling in this low cut. So it's sounding okay there at 144. I like to err on the side of thickness rather than thinness with guitars. So let's just do a bypass actually here. I just have a feeling that this is just a bit too steep, too much. Yeah, so it's cutting loads out, so I just think that's a bit too much. So let's start again. So that's feeling better. It still feels a little bit woolly, still 100 Hertz heavy. So what I'm going to do here, I think, is just going to play with this Q. And that's evened that low end woofiness out for me. So where I was hearing that sort of low rumbly stuff at 100 Hertz that was getting louder and quieter depending on how the guitars were being played, by just applying this, just changing the cue slightly to apply a bit more cut in that area, that coming and going seemed to disappear. So I'll zero this and hopefully you'll hear it if I apply it again. Okay, so that just feels as though that's the first step taken into cleaning up these guitars. Now the next area I look at is usually about 200 Hertz, and I'll just grab a bell curve there and just pull a couple of dBs out, and that's usually enough. So I'll just zero that and do our little trick again where we just listen to it and then make the EQ move. So that's feeling better, feels like we've got even more clarity in. But what we have to bear in mind is how these guitars are interacting with the bass guitar, and we've not listened to the guitars with the bass. And this is something I do often, and that's solo groups of instruments together with their complementary instrument, which with heavy guitars is the bass guitar. And we want that, it's all about that low end grunt and energy. And the bass forms so much of that feeling that we need to really bring that in. I'm going to solo the bass as well. So let's hear the bass and the guitars now. And let's bypass what we've done with the guitars. You can just hear how jumbled those low mids sound. So let's try again and bring this EQ in on the guitars. Something I've taken to doing more often these days, and that's rather than going for like that static EQ standard, grab hold with a bell curve and pull. What I've tended to do is actually use a dynamic EQ in this instance. And the reason for that is to try and maintain a more regular or even sounding frequency response across the low end of the guitars, because it only actually cuts when that particular frequency gets a little bit too excessive. So what we do there is just basically right click on the Pro Q3 and just make that dynamic. There are lots of dynamic EQs out there for you to have a go at and do this, but it just automatically puts in a bit of threshold there, I guess, for the dynamic EQ to start working. So you can see there with the movement of the line that it's only working when it needs to. And I find that can oftentimes avoid that danger of making your guitars or anything sound too thin. This I find works really well for me on guitars. Nice, okay, I'm going to stick with that. So that kind of ends properly, or ties a knot in our subtractive EQ. That's the whole point, or the whole reason for me for choosing the Pro Q3. It's a clean sound and it doesn't impart any tone. It's just there to do a job. And we've done that. Next, we start to move on to the really more interesting side of EQing for me, which is to use channel strips. So my first channel strip of choice for guitar is the HLS, the Kramer HLS from Waves. And I really love how this sounds on guitars. Like I said at the start of the video, it just seems to have a magical quality when you use it on guitars. And the great thing about it is that it takes away, as I've discussed in previous videos, it takes away choice. You only have these few frequencies to choose from. Where I tend to use this on guitars is this shelf at the top here, which you can see is set to 10K. It's not 12, it's not 15. You don't have to think about it. It's a shelf and it's 10K. So let's see what that sounds like. And then the next band down here, this mid band, that works brilliantly as well on bringing the crunch and the edge of guitars out. But start off with, I'm just going to go with this 10, I'm going to start from top, work my way down to the bottom. So we start here, this 10K shelf, and see what it can do to these guitars. I think that sounds great. It just sounds magic. It's really brought out the clarity of the guitars, the top end of the guitars. But just that boost there, plus 4 dB, 10K shelf, sounds great. So let's check out the guitars in the mix now. So yeah, really brings them out, pulls them out of the mix completely. Without this 10K shelf, it's just still sounding somewhat dull. But we're not done there with this channel strip. There's this mid frequency selection here. And the 2 frequencies here that I want you to keep in mind, or I want you to remember, is 2.8, which is where it defaults to, but also 1.4. On some occasions, you may find that 2 works. You may even find that 3.5 works. But my 2 frequencies that I tend to use the most are 2.8 and 1.4. Because it defaults to 2.8, let's start there. I'm going to solo the guitars. I'm going to listen for a few seconds, and then I'm going to dial some of this 2.8K into our guitars. Doesn't need to be much. It just brings so much clarity to the guitars. That's 1 dB there. So that's sounding great. Let's listen to the in the mix then. So I'm really pleased with that. That's sounding great. Let's see what happens if we push some of these frequencies too far. I'll do this in the context of the mix this time. So I think pushing that 2.8, you start getting into the realms of a little bit of harshness coming in. Harshness on guitars tends to live around about 4K, 3.5K, 4K, something like that. And it just doesn't sound particularly nice. Let's reopen this Pro Q3. Let's put in 4K here. Let's just kind of narrow this up and do a bit of a boost and have a listen to this. Perhaps need a bit more of a boost. Okay. So that's not particularly nice either. That's 3.5. And going up to 4.5K, just getting that kind of it's really ear piercing. But as I said, I don't think that these guitars suffer from it particularly. And what I would do if you do have guitars that you feel have got this harsh edge to them is to do the method I've said, where you listen for a second or two or for a bar, and then just start to pull out a little bit of 4K and see where that gets you. You can hear how that just naturally calms down the top edge of the guitar. I'm going to get rid of that because I don't really feel as though I need that. And let's revisit the HLS. What I do want to do is now I want to perhaps see what the 1.4 sounds like as an alternative. So let's try that. And that again sounds really great, but it's more pointed, it's more mid tonal quality to it, which you would expect, 1.4K. So let's see what that sounds like in the mix. And what I'll do is set a level of boost, let's say 1.5 dB boost, where you've got fixed bands like this in a channel strip. You can just flick between the bands to see which one you prefer the sound of. And it just makes decision making so much easier when you've not got every single band to consider. And also, I'm giving you some pointers here, some frequencies that you can go to as starting points to get the best out of the guitar. So you don't have to do that searching and hunting anymore. So flicking there between the 1.4 and the 2.8, definitely the 2.8, because we just are missing so much in the way of crispness on these recordings. So 2.8 is the way to go in this particular case. Now that's not to say you later on in the mix, when we've got synths in and vocals in, that you can't return to 1.4 and give that a push in another instance of the plugin to see if that brings it out. So there, do what you need to do to get the job done. Now, I've lost perspective now on these guitars, pushing and pulling these different frequencies. So I'm going to zero out that mid boost again on the 2.8. I'm going to listen to the mix and I'm going to dial in the right amount that I feel is going to work on these guitars. So that feels about right, the right spot for me there. So from this point on, I'm happy to continue working now with this mix. And this is where you've done a whole load of heavy lifting on the bus that you created to deal with these bulky sounding guitars in one fell swoop. So now you can go through, if you still feel as though there are tonal issues, you could hunt through each of the tracks, soloing each one, to find the culprit, the main problem. If you felt there was still some sort of heavy, thick sound here that's not being tackled with what you've already done, not tackled in full, then you can go and do a little bit of investigative work with the solo button, find it, and then go in with a Pro Q and fix it. So that's the plan with electric guitars, is to consider the low end, consider how much rumble there is, go in with a low cut filter, anywhere between 40 and 100 hertz. in some cases 120 hertz. But that kind of span, go find your low cut filter or your high pass filter and work it in with the bass guitar and settle on a spot that you feel locks the two together. Then there's usually something to be done around about 250. That kind of 200 to 250, that need to pull a little bit out there. Same as you do with the bass guitar as well. All the instruments build up terribly in that area. So we're just doing these little carving moves within each instrument group to get everything to sit together in a mix. Another great channel strip, renowned for working brilliantly on guitars, is the Trident A range. And let's play around with that. I've got it on the melody guitar group here. Let's solo up these melody guitars. And this is what I've done already. You can see that I've done a low cut filter here, 12 dB per octave, 82 hertz on these melody guitars. And then you can see I've got a little dynamic EQ working at 120. So not the 250 as such, but certainly in that 100 to 300 hertz area where things can build up. Let's bypass both of these EQs and see what each one brings. So that's why there's those two low, long-held notes that were just getting a little bit thick sounding. And that's the beauty of dynamic EQ. It's not there all the time. It's only when it's called upon. And you could see it there on the spectrum analyzer. So then following that up, I decided to go with the Trident. Amazing. So that is 10K. And it's a boost of 4.5 dBs. And the ranges that you've got here to choose from, again, it's fixed, like a channel strip, because it is a channel strip. But you can do that whole thing. You can do the boost, and then you can flick between the frequencies to decide which one works best for your particular track. But you've got a great selection of frequencies here, and it just is renowned for sounding great on guitars. And the reason for choosing a Trident here rather than choosing the Kramer is I wanted that different flavour again. I honestly think that when you start using mixing up the analogue emulations and the harmonic distortion that's inherent in them, it's adding to that sense of width and depth and 3D-ness with the harmonics. So that's the guitars EQ'd in this mix. And as I said at the start, those frequencies that I'm talking about work equally well on clean electrics as well. Same kind of idea, go in with a low cut, then scoop a bit out in the sort of 250 area, and then look for some brightness at 1.4 or 2.8 areas, and take it from there. You should be really close to a good guitar sound there. Depending on the quality of the tracks you've been given, there's always that caveat, I'm afraid. Let's check out this mix then. Okay, hope you enjoyed that. And if you've got any comments or questions about what I've done, then please just drop it in the comments section below, and I'll do my very best to answer promptly. But I'd love to know how you tackle guitars and whether you happen to use the same frequency areas or thereabouts, or the same mentality at least anyway. Also, actually, I'd really love to know if you've got any go-to plugins that you like to use on guitars. I've got my Kramer and I've got the Trident there. So I'd love to know if you've got a recommendation on that score that I can try out on my next mix. If you like the sound of the track that I've been working with today, then head off to the description box below, because in there is a link to my free drum mixing workshop. You can sign up, get the Multitracks, get some cheat sheets. We all love a cheat sheet. So sign up, play along, mix along, have some fun, and I'd love to know how you get on. Don't forget, before you go, to hit the like button. That always helps. And to subscribe if you haven't already. So that's it from me, and I'll see you in the next video.